First, I'm going to do like a little thought experiment I find really valuable when talking about this subject. And let's imagine, if we all would, that you're sitting in your house and one of your friends, someone you know really well, comes running in and says, "You're not going to believe this. I was just outside. I saw this silvery metallic thing fly over, and it just kind of stopped where it was overhead. And I saw it for like 3 minutes, and then it shot off so fast that I've never seen anything like it." So let's assume you know your friend is not hallucinating. Your friend's not taking, LSD or psilocybin or something like that. Your friend hasn't been drinking. You know this person really well, and you know they're not playing a trick on you. I would think that perhaps you might believe this person. You might still be a little on the fence about what he or she saw. But let's expand that. Let's say 5 of your friends are together, and they come in. They're all freaking out. They're very clearly blown away by what just happened, and they all say the same thing. And they're all not on drugs. They're all not drinking. They're all not pulling your leg. Then I think it becomes a little more compelling to accept that maybe they did actually see what they said they saw. So let's expand that to thousands of people. Let's expand that to tens of thousands of people who have pretty much said a similar thing, that they've seen some kind of structured thing in the sky, not just lights in the sky. We'll throw away all the lights in the sky because they could be deceptive. But these people have seen something that resembles an object, a structured object, often cylindrical or saucer-shaped, not always, triangular, rectangular sometimes. But it's clearly something anomalous. It's something not ordinary in the way that it looks and the way that it performs. Then I think we might find it even a little more compelling. And that's exactly what we're dealing with this subject, is there are tens of thousands of people who claim to have seen these objects. And just as if one of your friends came in, or 5 of your friends came in and said they saw something similar, it's hard for me to understand how someone can say, well, they're all hallucinating, they're all drunk, they're all on drugs, they're all misapprehending the planet Venus, or whatever else we hear. So just keep that in mind as we look at some of this evidence. And I'm going to do sort of a quick whirlwind tour. One thing when you're thinking about these claims of seeing something strange is also, reminds me of a quote by William James when he talks about the white crow. Is if you wish to upset the law that all crows are black, don't try to show that no crows are. You just have to find one white crow. And with these tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of sightings, it only takes one of them to be something truly anomalous and not explained by conventional means to really kind of upset our worldview. So the reality and the impossible. As someone who's studied this ever since I was a kid, my dad used to leave little paperback UFO books lying around, and I'd pick them up and read them. So this is something I've been fascinated with my entire life. So I think it is one of the most important subjects in history. It's one of the most important things that has ramifications for science, religion, cosmology, anthropology. So is it that? Or is it a joke? And we've all seen, we've all seen the media all the time, how anything related to UFOs or alien abductions or anything remotely like that becomes a joke. And if you've ever seen if you've ever seen a news report, either on local news or national news, cable news, something like that, where they talk about a UFO sighting, and they actually talk about it fairly seriously, inevitably, you'll notice at the end, one of the anchors will say, well, I guess we'll see the little green men next, or something like that. There's a reflexive need to make a joke about it. And that's reflected in our entertainment, it's reflected in the scientific community, which until 20, 30 years ago actually took this subject very seriously. And then of course, there's always guys like this who make it very easy to laugh at claims of aliens. And this is if you don't know him, this is the Ancient Aliens guy. There's even a drinking game for watching Ancient Aliens, is anytime someone says, or could it be Ancient Aliens who make you drink? So, So really, when you're walking in to this subject, you have to really try to keep yourself as objective as possible, because there are depths of insanity and just dead ends that you can go down, and some can actually wind up being pretty dangerous, you know, to your own self, to your conceptions of reality. I mean, I've seen people go way off the edge into, you know, talking about channeled Ashtarian masters and things like that, which, you know, is perfectly fine if you want to make that your ideology. Some of it is a little difficult for me to handle, but then you'll see some things that I'm going to say that might be a little difficult for you to handle too, I think. So let's look at what the skeptics and the debunkers say. These are the things I hear all the time when talking about this subject, and there may be some of you who have some of the same beliefs. Is that, first of all, there's no evidence. Photos and videos we see are all, you know, blurry, or they're hoaxes. There's a lack of credible observers. And I pulled a quote out of the Skeptics Dictionary that basically says UFOs are usually observed by untrained sky watchers, and almost never astronomers or people who spend a lot of time looking at the heavens above. So we'll see some examples that show that's not the case. The witnesses are just, you know, country bumpkins. They're deluded, they're on drugs, they're drunk, or they're misidentifying natural phenomena. There's also, hey, the government studied the phenomenon and concluded there's nothing to it. You conspiracy nut, you know, go peddle your craziness somewhere else. Let's just take a look at one of these. And I hear, well, why don't they just land on the White House lawn? Which I think is a pretty stupid question, because it presupposes that whatever this intelligence is behind this phenomenon, that they would just want to land on the White House lawn. But in 1952, summer of 1952, there were UFOs flying all over Washington, D.C. This picture is not legitimate, so don't think this is, at least I haven't been able to assure its legitimacy. I'm just using it to kind of illustrate. I would point that out if I'm using an image that's not credible. How this started was in July, an airplane flying into the airport, D.C. The pilot and a stewardess on the plane called into the airport and said, there are these weird lights flying around out there. We're a little concerned. So they called the airport. The radar tower gets confirmation. They relay their confirmation over to Andrews Air Force Base, who says, yeah, we have these things on the radar too. Then a master sergeant at Andrews Air Force Base goes out to take a look, and what he describes as shooting stars with no tails, faster than any shooting star he's ever seen before. And he's seeing several of them, and they're doing really strange maneuvers in the sky. This went on for like a week. These are just a couple of anecdotes from two of the brief bursts of serious activity. Then, so Albert M. Chop, who was the press officer for Project Blue Book, which was the first government-sponsored inquiry into UFOs, was headed by J. Allen Hynek, who we'll talk about later. So the press officer for Project Blue Book arrives, goes and looks at the radar, and then tells the reporters they can't take photos or tape of the radar screens, and there's stuff happening on the radar screens. So then he goes and pulls himself in the room with the radar technicians and shuts the door. Radar at both airports, at Andrews and at National Airport, picked up unknowns in every sector that they had, moving at variable speeds and in patterns up to what they calculated as 7,000 miles per hour. So they scramble some Air Force jets. That's what they like to do back in this time period. It was the Cold War thing, weird things are flying around. You scramble some jets to get a good look at it. One of the pilots sees nothing while he's up there. The other sees 4 glowing objects. And as he pulls close to them, they surround his airplane, which makes him freak out a little bit and call the tower and say, hey, these things are surrounding me, what do I do? And there was what he described in his words as stunned silence. They didn't know what to do. And then the 4 objects sped away. So we have radar confirmation, we've got visual confirmation from people on the ground, not just at the airports, but all over DC, who were later on the record talking about this. So we have civilians and military personnel. There are lots of civilians that saw these things too, looked up there. And not just lights, but some of them actually saw, again, these metallic, structured looking things flying around. So President Truman is not happy that there are all these strange lights flying around. So he gets on the phone with the Air Force and the head of Blue Book, a man named Ruppelt. And Blue Book says, well, we'll get right on it and try to figure out what this is. And there are several reports in the papers at the time that say that the White House had given orders to shoot these things down if they couldn't communicate with them. But in every case, according to the pilots afterward, as soon as they'd get close enough, these lights would accelerate and get away. So they're just chasing these things around all over Washington, D.C. for roughly a week in bursts of time. So then on July 29th, as things have died down, the Air Force holds a press conference, and it's actually the largest press conference they've had since World War II. This stuff was in the papers. You can go look at local papers from the time. It's everywhere in the papers. And the Air Force's explanation is that all these people that saw these things misidentified natural phenomenon, stars or meteors. And as far as the radar traces go, that those were due to a temperature inversion, okay? Which the majority of the people in the aircraft tower that went on the record and said, no, we know what temperature inversions are. These were not temperature inversions. Temperature inversions are very, very easy to see what they are on radar. So we've got all of these people, Air Force personnel, air traffic controllers, and dozens of others, civilians and military, have gone on the record and said, this is bullshit. You know, we don't believe this. And again, all the stuff I'm saying here, if you're a little skeptical about it, I encourage you. There are a couple of books that cover these subjects really well, and they have the actual documents. Also, if you go to my website, I post a lot of the actual declassified government documents. And this is one of them right here. This came around December after the military intelligence had done sort of an analysis of what was going on. And you can see, they clearly say, at this time, sightings of unexplained objects at great altitudes and traveling at high speeds in the vicinity of major U.S. defense installations are of such nature that they are not attributable to natural phenomena or known type of aerial vehicles. This went to the Deputy Director of Intelligence. It's called the Chadwell Memorandum, very famous document. And just to say that this is kind of funny, in 2002, again, we have these lights flying around over Washington, D.C. There's a quote from a guy who stepped outside in Waldorf and he said he saw this light blue object racing through the sky, and it was being chased by 2 Air Force jets. Military officials didn't deny it. They had the jets up there, and they said whatever it was, we don't know what it was, it just disappeared. And again, this is on the record. NORAD is on the record saying, yeah, there was something there, and we chased it, and we don't know what it was. And the guy, his quote at the bottom is, he said, hey, it looked just like a shooting star with no trailing mist. He's never seen anything like it. So interesting that, you know, again in July, many, many years later, something very similar takes place. And again, it's documented in the government's own records. Let's look at another case real quickly. I find this one fascinating. This is an astronomer. You hear the suggestions that astronomers and astronauts, people like that, never see these things. Well, this guy was in Jersey City, and he's an amateur astronomer with the Toronto Astronomical Society. He's out there, he sees this really large light, and he knows this glowing circular shaped object. He's very familiar with looking at the stars and what's in the sky. And it's moving very strangely, and according to his calculations, it has to be moving incredibly fast. He watches it for a long time and makes a really dramatic maneuver at one point. So what does he do? He's a good astronomer. He contacts the U.S. Naval Observatory, and they ignore him. They ignore him. He writes a letter. So he gets pissed. He writes a letter that's published in the New York Tribune, and they give it the title of A Curious Phenomenon, also published in Scientific American. So then his peers start writing, oh, this is crazy, he must have misidentified Venus, or there was a comet, Brorson's comet at the time. But he clearly had made sure that this wasn't Brorson's comet, and the object that he was watching vanished after a while, or flew away. So clearly comets don't just fly away. But then 2 other astronomers wrote in and said, yeah, we saw this thing too. We watched it, you know, so there's validation. One of them described it as circular and bell-shaped. There's some drawings from across time of sort of bell-shaped UFOs people claim they saw. Does anyone want to guess when this happened? 1879. Okay, so this thing goes back way back if you begin to look through the historical record. And if you look really far back, and this is some really nice images from artwork. This I think was in Germany in the 16th century when people saw, again, kind of a rectangular thing flying around and this sort of spaceship looking thing. But over here we have in art and iconography things that, you know, resembles people flying around ships. Of course, we have no idea if that is actually tied, but it's certainly suggestive. The real modern UFO period began in 1947. That's when this guy, Kenneth Arnold, was out flying his plane. He was a civilian pilot and a businessman. He's flying near Mount Rainier, and he sees these 9 objects flying along. And one of them looked like this, like a sort of a delta winged shape. The others were sort of, he's described as sort of like pie pans turned upside down. Interestingly, he said they looked like, the way they moved, the way he described their movement was like a saucer skipping across water. Not that they looked like saucers, but that their movement was like a saucer skipping across water. And the media at the time picked up on that, and that's why they started being called flying saucers. So even though one of them looked like this, looked nothing like the classic flying saucer, this was really the birth of the whole UFO, the modern UFO era. And it was huge. This was an enormous worldwide media event. And of course, 1947 was also when this famous headline appeared, talking about a crashed disc that had been retrieved. And I'm not even going to get into Roswell. I think it's like a swamp. Mm-hmm. I know a lot of people sort of focus on that as some kind of proof. I find it to be almost a waste of time. There's so much misinformation, disinformation, that I just kind of leave this out of my talk. But if you're interested in it, you can spend, you know, the rest of your life reading about the various theories of Roswell. I prefer to focus on some other things. This is also UFOs, when there are lots of them and lots of sightings, they either call it a wave or a flap. And there's an entire report put together by Dr. James McDonald that covers this wave of UFOs. I mean, they were appearing all over the world in very large numbers at the time. And this is when popular consciousness really latched on to this phenomenon. Now we'll look at some photos. Again, you could spend a lot of time, you know, going over photos, but these are some of the most analyzed UFO photos of all time. I mean, and skeptics have tried to find, you know, wires or something like that. They've really been unable to do so. That when I've looked at the skeptical explanations for these photos, now they go along with it. There was a couple, the Trent, their name Trent was their last name, and the skeptics' only real criticism that they could find is that the people lied about what time it was or something like that. Even though they took these photos, the photos they were hanging on a wall at the bank, and when a reporter saw them and said, "What is this?" went and found the Trents, and they explained what had happened. They said, "Yeah, we were outside. I saw this thing. I yelled for my husband to get his camera." This is 1950. Not quite sure. But there are two photos that they took. This is an enlargement of that thing in the first, that object in the first. This is the second. And you know, again, there's a guy named Bruce Maccabee who works for the U.S. Navy. He's an optical physicist. You may have seen him on UFO TV shows, things like that. He did an analysis with the original negatives that he got his hands on. And no one can really find anything as far as a hoax or what this could be. So these are considered some of the best photographic evidence. There's a close-up of the thing. Now, unfortunately, computer graphics has destroyed the validity of any UFO photo or video. I don't know if any of you remember this thing. I mean, it was going all over Facebook and Twitter years ago, a couple of years ago. And you know, it was really well done, beautifully well done, but then people started taking a look at it. First of all, when something looks that good to me, I get suspicious. That's number one. But then people started taking the palm trees and noticed that, oh, this palm tree is identical to the other palm tree. But for someone who studies this subject, I mean, the digital photography has completely made it almost worthless to look at photos. I mean, unless you actually get the original file, but even then, I mean, you can edit the data in the photo and things like that. So it's really, you know, when I look at, I don't even really pay much attention to contemporary UFO photos and videos. I find most of the interesting stuff is from the 50s, 60s, and 70s before the advent of digital photography. This is a great case that happened close to here, Loch Raven Dam. I'm sure maybe many of you have been by there. This was 1958, and two guys were driving home in their car. When they got near the dam, they saw an egg-shaped object floating over the dam, about 100 to 150 feet above the dam. Their car went dead. It's a common thing you hear, that the car just completely died and came to a stop. The electrical systems weren't working, the car itself would not start. And then there was a huge flash of light, which left both of them reddened on the sides of their face that were facing the object. And then they heard a loud thunderous noise. The noise was later confirmed by a restaurant nearby. And the object, as it started to rise, it didn't just take off. It actually just kind of lost its substance. You know, it just sort of looked like it just kind of vanished, but slowly, so they could see it vanish. And that's another interesting thing. That's what starts to make, you know, people who who want an easy explanation for this stuff a little uneasy. You know, if these things, it's fine if it flies away into the night sky, but if it just disappears or it just appears, you know, that's some kind of physics that, you know, is off the charts. This is great. You can look this up on Wikipedia too. It's very well documented. This was Tehran, Iran, 1976, considered one of the best cases. For its documentation, as well as the quality of the people who were involved. Guy at an airport in Tehran started getting calls from people saying, hey, there are these lights flying around the sky, they're freaking us out, they're flying over Tehran. So he went out to look for himself, and sure enough, he sees several lights in the sky. So they scrambled a fighter jet that went up to take a look at it. And I have it in my notes, but I can't see my notes, but it doesn't matter what kind of jet it was. But it was a U.S. fighter jet. At the time, the U.S. Army was on very good terms and supplying Iran with airplanes and other military equipment. So the first plane goes up there, and as soon as he gets near one of these lights, it's a very big light, he described it as sort of a diamond shape, and it was multicolored. There were several colors. And it didn't look like it was linked together by a structure. It looked like these lights were sort of independent, but they were in a diamond-shaped formation. As soon as he gets near it, his airplane instrumentation starts to go wacky, so he flies down. In the meantime, another pilot's been called. He's the one that went, both pilots went on the record, but the second pilot, his name's Jafiri, his last name. He flies up to this thing, and as he gets close to it, his instrumentation starts to get a little out of whack too. And so he's kind of dodging it, flying around, and as he tries to one more time to get close to it, and he sees a white light come out of the bottom of it and starts shooting towards him. So he's scared, you know, he thinks this thing's shooting something at me, it's a missile. So he goes to engage his weapons. He actually had heat-seeking missiles, some other kind of missile on board. He went to engage to shoot this thing, shoot the little white object that was coming at him, and he couldn't. His weaponry instrumentation was completely wiped out. In the meantime, people on the ground are seeing these things. The encounter continues till when he lands. He's immediately taken to meet with the U.S. general who was there, the generals of the Iranian army. They put him through this long Q&A thing. He's then sent for blood work, and they tell him he has to come back once a month for 4 months to get his blood checked. He's not quite sure why. So he went on the record, his pilot went on the record, but then later on through some Freedom of Information Act documents, we find out that this was considered a high priority case for the U.S. Military and U.S. military intelligence. It was sent to the White House. It was sent to the director of the CIA. And this is also a declassified document that came out from the Defense Intelligence Agency. This a major colonel, and he said this is one of the classic cases for what he called this valid study of the UFO phenomenon, seen from multiple witnesses by different witnesses from different locations and viewpoints. The credibility was great. You've got a general who saw this thing from the ground. You've got experienced crew. It was also tracked on radar. I forgot to say that. The pilot mapped it on his radar and locked onto it with his radar. Visual sightings were confirmed by radar. Electromagnetic effects were reported by 3 separate aircraft. That's when their instrumentation went wacky and when the guy couldn't engage the missile. Physiological effects on some of the crew members. The brightness actually affected their night vision. And an inordinate amount of maneuverability was displayed by the UFO. So again, this is a declassified US document that talks about their evaluation of it, which is this is a genuine unknown. This is Philip Klass, who wrote for Aviation Weekly. He's no longer with us, but he was the king of UFO debunkers. And his explanation for this I love, which is that it was the planet Jupiter. That these experienced pilots who were up there seeing these things were completely misled by the planet Jupiter in the sky. And he completely discounts all the testimony from people on the ground that saw this stuff too. There are declassified Defense Department reports. This was in the Washington Post about nuclear missile sites and bomber bases that have been buzzed by whatever these things are. And the Air Force sent fighter planes to find them unsuccessfully. Often, again, as the planes get close, these things just take off at a speed that the planes can't keep up with. And there are multiple documents documenting this stuff as well, too. So I'll try to speed it up a little bit. This is more recent. You may have even seen this in the news. It was kind of a big thing. 20 miles from Heathrow Airport, the captain sees what he called like a cigar rugby ball shaped thing, and he was so freaked out by it, he threw his arms up in the air like that because he thought it was actually going to hit him. And there are reports. There's an organization called NARCAP, which I can't remember what the acronym's for, but they take reports from pilots when something like this happens. And from the 1950s to like 2002, when they last compiled them, they have 140,000 reports of pilot encounters with unknowns. So anytime you hear someone say, no, pilots never see these things, it's not true. A lot of times pilots do not want to report that they've seen it because it can jeopardize their job. People will ridicule them for seeing it, so a lot of times they keep quiet. This again was this was looked at, and the aviation authorities like we have no idea what it was, what he saw. So deception and cover-up, it's sort of a joke to talk about UFO cover-ups and conspiracies, but we have this. Roscoe Hillenkoetter was the first director of the Central Intelligence Agency, again, for that magical year, 1947, through 1950, the very first director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He said, this is on the record in the New York Times in 1960, behind the scenes, we're really concerned about it. But through official secrecy and ridicule, citizens like us are led to believe it's nonsense. So he said, in order to hide the facts, the Air Force has silenced its personnel from talking about it. And there are multiple examples of people who, after they retire, actually don't feel compelled to not talk about it anymore and go on the record and actually talk about it. But this was interesting. This was for the Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ. It's a British intelligence agency. It's kind of the equivalent of our NSA. This is their website. Originally, it was called the Government Code and Cipher School, just like the NSA. It was all about encryption. Thanks to Edward Snowden's leaks, we know that what GCHQ has done is it has eavesdropped on politicians at the G20 summit and on UN delegates. They've covertly installed keyloggers on UN delegates' computers, not so nice. They take that information, they fed it to select UK politicians. And you know, it shouldn't surprise us, it happens here too. Also, there's a project called Tempora, which is for surveillance. The GCHQ can also tap into the PRISM project, which if you use Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and Skype, they have a built-in backdoor to get anything, any of your data they want. So this organization, it has an agreement with the NSA in the US to tap into that information as well. They also, the Snowden leaks revealed this part of the organization that no one had known about before. It's called JTRIG, or Joint Threat Research Intelligence Group. And these are some slides that Snowden got. However, he got them. It's called The Art of Deception. And it's basically training for online covert operations for people who are working specifically to put disinformation online. And in the middle of these slides, there are these photos with no text accompanying them. So we have no context at all. I don't know. So, you know, what does that mean? We could speculate all day. But the fact that this is one of their slides for training covert operatives to spread misinformation online, I find that kind of intriguing. So maybe there are operations still going on that have something to do with either making us not believe, making us believe. Hard to say. The 1999 Roper poll. What are UFOs? Okay, so we're switch gears a little bit. 25% of people, alien spaceships. I mean, that's what people generally tend to say. Oh, UFO, alien spaceship. 19% believe it's just, you know, misinterpretations of natural phenomena. 12% a secret government program. 9% hallucinations, and 7% travelers from other dimensions, which seems kind of silly, but you know, I'll show you some things in a few minutes that maybe it's not so silly. But the interesting fact from a 1997 Gallup poll, 80% of people surveyed in the US believe that the government is hiding evidence of extraterrestrial life. That's a pretty big number, and actually kind of surprising. So, the extraterrestrial hypothesis, the most common explanation we have for what these things are. Makes sense to me. The universe is a factory for life. There's nucleic acids out floating around in space. We have comets, which we now know carry abundant water, and which may have brought water to the Earth, which allowed life to get started here. The universe is full of water. And this is old. This is from October of last year. So the numbers have dramatically increased of exoplanets. So, you know, it's not so difficult anymore to believe that there could be something out there besides us. In fact, I think it's kind of silly if you think life could have only originated here. And that, of course, is the topic that is covered a lot by people who study UFOs. They just sort of assume, well, it's extraterrestrial. It has to be. What else could it be? These are all books, the kind of books I would have picked up as a kid. And you know, most approaches to the phenomenon say that yeah, it's extraterrestrial. Of course it is. But there's something that started happening. UFO investigators, especially in the late 60s and early 70s, they started, as they talked to each other, they started realizing that, you know, this stuff's getting a little weird. You know, it used to be someone would see something flying around the sky. Well, now they're talking about these things landing and seeing these beings come out, or you know, even worse, these beings kind of communicate with them somehow, or they see this thing in the sky, and then they go home and things start flying around their house, like a poltergeist sort of phenomenon. They first started calling that high strangeness. But also the Oz factor. British investigator Jenny Randall's highly respected investigator of this stuff. She said that witnesses feel almost like they've been transported to another world during their experiences. The experience itself, especially when there's some close encounters, so to speak, gets strange. People feel like they're in a different time, slows down. Things are very different. So her hypothesis is that perhaps it's the consciousness of the witness that's the focal point of the experience. And then we start having things like abductions, alleged abductions. This is Betty and Barney Hill, the first really well-known abduction case. They were driving home. They saw a light in the sky. Barney decided to follow it. Later, they woke up wondering how they had gotten home. Classic, what's now known as missing time experience. They started having nightmares of beings doing things to them and stuff like that. So they actually contacted a hypnotist to try to help them deal with the nightmares they were having. This is it's a great, well-studied abduction case that really, again, critics have tried to take it apart in lots of ways, but it's really withstood a lot of scrutiny. And these two guys in Pascagoula, Mississippi, were fishing when they saw this kind of egg-shaped craft come down, and this odd-looking thing came out of it, paralyzed them, took them in, and they didn't know what to do. They called the police. The police brought them in, and even though these guys were scared out of their minds, there were clearly something traumatic had happened to them, he took the extra precaution to put them in a room that had hidden microphones in it. And the tapes still exist, and these guys were talking amongst themselves, completely scared to death about what had happened to them, not really understanding what had happened, worried about what the reputation was going to be if this ever came out, things like that. Another classic account. The high strangeness that I was talking about, that a lot of these investigators were encountering, but they didn't want to talk about, because, I mean, the subject is weird enough already, okay? When you start saying, well, this woman's, she seems very, very competent and not hallucinating, but she says when she got home, things start moving around in her house. That takes it to another level that a lot of people just do not want to go there. But these are some of the things that were continuing to pop up regularly. Is, quote, poltergeist activity, things moving around. Interference with electrical and mechanical devices. Someone walked by the TV, it goes off, things like that. Development of psychic abilities. These people start saying, I have these like psychic intuitions now that have happened since I had my encounter with this thing or sighting of it. Lots of coincidences, synchronicities, things like that. Unusual phone calls. And the classic Men in Black, which a lot of people only know from the funny movie. But this scared a lot of people. They were getting visits from alleged government operatives that acted kind of strange. And helicopters. Now, I was a little skeptical about this. I was interviewing a woman who was an alleged abductee. I listened to her tape of her regressions and things like that. Clearly, she believed what this stuff was. Helicopters are flying over my house. She lived in Severna Park, right down in Anne Arundel County. I wasn't too sure about that, but then she took out pictures she had taken of these black helicopters over her house, and okay, maybe you are telling the truth, and what does that mean? There's J. Allen Hynek, who was originally, he's the guy that coined the term swamp gas for a mass sighting that happened in Illinois and people were pissed at him. He was the head of the government project Blue Book. He was their main scientist. Over time, he began to realize that this is real. I mean, he was originally very skeptical about the whole phenomenon, but as he investigated it, he saw the number of unknowns. So what he says, after this strange stuff that he's hearing, he starts to think, but whether this intelligence is extraterrestrial or bespeaks a higher reality not yet recognized by science, or even if it be in some way or another a strange psychic manifestation of our own intelligence, is really the question. This was in front of the UN in 1978, sorry. And this guy, Jacques Vallée, who I consider one of the premier ufologists out there. He actually, unlike Al Gore, he actually was instrumental in building the internet. He worked at DARPA, so he was part of ARPANET when they put they started the basis of the internet. But he also was very much a proponent of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. But then the evidence pushed him the other way to a point where he published a very influential paper that pissed off a lot of ufologists that argued against the extraterrestrial hypothesis. He said these things aren't acting like they're from another planet, or they're not acting like in a rational way of something that will be, sort of observing our Earth. So his ideas have changed as he got to understand the data more. So what he says is this technology is capable of manipulating space and time in ways that we don't understand. It's also manipulating the psychic environment of the witness. And again, that's pretty weird. That's a far stretch from these nuts and bolts things flying around in the sky. And he wrote this book called The Invisible College, which was basically about him and Hynek and some other people who were studying this stuff who didn't want to go public about it because it was too weird. So they kept it amongst themselves and circulated the information among themselves. He says, I think we're dealing with something that is both technological and psychic and seems to be able to manipulate other dimensions. He says, this is not wishful thinking or speculation. It's his conclusion from interviewing people and listening to what they have to say. And what they have to say is not that they've seen spacecraft coming down from the sky. Sometimes they see something materialize in front of them and then go away. They're saying these beings walk through their walls or something like that. That doesn't seem to be, high technology. Could be. He said the part here that I think is important is that the believer's mistake in the second paragraph is to ascribe meaning and credence to the secondary perception. That's what people are saying they're seeing happening. That's why the space aliens came down. And they told me I was part of the Ashtar command, and I'm the savior of humanity, stuff like that. That's what happens. That's what our brains are telling us, or the brains of experiencers are telling us. The skeptic's mistake is to deny the reality of the stimulus altogether, simply because the secondary perception, what the people are saying, seems absurd. So it gets into this really tricksterish idea about what this stuff is. What we take to be reality, he thinks could be more of a projection. That what these things are is they're projecting something into our reality. He calls it a control system as a method to control our behavior. So he says the best way to look at this, and I agree, is between closed-minded skeptic and closed-minded believer. I'll try to hurry this up. I think I'm getting near 30. Let's see. And this is another thing that I find a really good quote, is that this is Jerry Clark, who's written about this stuff for a long time. We can believe our informants. We can believe them, that they experience something, without having to believe their explanations, okay? So I've talked to these people. I know a lot of them are very serious. They believe what happened to them, that they're certain that it was real. We don't have to believe what they tell us that it was or what it means. So quickly, I'll go into my experience and tell you why I kind of gravitate towards the Jacques Vallée camp instead of the nuts and bolts UFO camp. It's 1990, I'm at the beach in Ocean City. I'm reading a lot about aliens and UFOs and all that sort of thing. This is Whitley Strieber's famous book. I mean, this is why you see the little alien face everywhere. This was the book that did it. It was top of the bestseller list. So I'm at the beach with some friends. We're making sand sculptures. I made a little alien head with his hand waving hello. Several weeks later, I'm back at the beach again. And I have a dream. And in the dream, I'm watching a panel of ufologists. There's a guy who's like, they're all lizards, they're going to eat us. They're run by Illuminati Jews and stuff like that. Then there's a guy who's a little more rational. Then there's a sort of Jacques Vallée type person, and there was a skeptic. So in my head, this dream, I woke up and I wrote it down, because whenever I have a dream that's, kind of interesting, more interesting than usual, I write it down. I'm out on the beach, and we're leaving, my girlfriend and I. And it's nighttime, beautiful sky, we're walking along the beach, and I see a face in the sand. Now, it wasn't the alien face, but someone had clearly made a face in the sand. This is in September, so it's not like a lot of people are at the beach. So my girlfriend sees it, I see it, and in me that triggers the thought of, hey, that's kind of funny, that alien face I made, weeks before, so it was definitely not the same thing. Just started a train of thought. So I looked up at the sky, it was absolutely clear, and I said, in my head, mentally, just looking up, my girlfriend's kind of wandering a little further down the beach, I said, okay, if you're out there, show yourself. Perfect opportunity, there's no one around. And I really meant it kind of as a joke, maybe 20% real, maybe it will happen, the rest, but I really thought it was kind of a mental joke sort of thing. And then my girlfriend says, what are those things? About 5 minutes after I made that little, mental, in more ways than one, request. And when she saw these two orange lights, they were bobbing up and down like that. And when I turned to look at them, they started shooting across the sky. And having grown up near an airport, these things were not conventional, and they were bright. They were about that size. This was long before the Chinese lanterns were around, but these were propelled. I mean, they weren't being blown in the wind, they were propelled. They did these kind of crazy maneuvers. They came together as one for a little while. Then they split apart again. The whole time, my girlfriend and I asked her, before I did this talk, to confirm it for me one more time with her account. And we were both, remember, we were just going, oh my God, 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 over and over as we watched these things fly. And then they shot off. It disappeared into the light, which was down by the Ocean City boardwalk. Okay, so that's a serious, I mean, even though I'd read about this stuff a lot, to actually have it happen was a bit of a mind blower and a little bit of a game changer. And the elements that came along with it, which were, having this dream about UFOs, which, again, maybe coincidence, maybe not. The sand sculptor making a face of an alien, seeing, I mean, that other face, whatever it was, even though it was kind of messed up, was what made me think in the first place to say, hey, were you out there? Show yourself. The invitation to show yourselves, and then actually something showing up, and the lights appearing. So I emailed, I knew Bud Hopkins, who was a guy who used to do a lot of hypnotic regression for people, which is problematic in its own right for confabulation, things like that. But he did some good research. And he said, he sent chills down my spine when I wrote him about this. He said, hey, who set that up? Did you ask for it, or was all that kind of put there in advance for you to see? Were you following their script? And I don't actually want to believe that, but I threw it in there because I find it a little disturbing to think that might be the case. Here is a paper Valet wrote with Eric Davis, some of you might know. And he talks about the layer 5, the 5th category of effects, which talks about impressions of communication without a sensory channel, poltergeist phenomena, maneuvers appearing in anticipation of the witness's thoughts, premonitions, dreams, or visions, personality changes, things like that. I mean, this is what was happening here. So that's why I like Valet. So Valet started wondering, can you make these things appear? The people who have talked about making discarnate entities appear are occultists, So he started looking into these occult groups who say they can invoke things. He called it the attempted manipulation of UFO manifestations. This guy claims that he did. He drew this thing he called LAM, which was a trans-Plutonian entity. This was, I think, 1940-something or other, long before the bug-headed, big-eyed alien became so iconic. Interesting. I mean, I'm throwing it out there. So this is Robert Anton Wilson, who some of you might know too. He's a philosopher, writer. He wrote the Illuminatus trilogy. He went and was interviewing Valet. He said, well, you must have a hunch where they come from. Valet says, well, they relate to space-time in ways that we have no concepts. And he asked Grady McMurtry to Crowley, had ever mentioned the extraterrestrial theory. He said, yeah, he said you could interpret it that way, or things he said. They don't always have to be some, and when you're ready, they come for you. Terence McKenna, does anyone know Terence McKenna? Another philosopher. Also the guy who, since I also talk about psychedelics, he basically invented the technique for growing psilocybin mushrooms that made psilocybin mushrooms available in the 70s. But fascinating guy. He's written a lot about UFOs. I love this quote. We're part of a symbiotic relationship with something which disguises itself as an extraterrestrial invasion so as not to alarm us. That's kind of true. I mean, we're really used to the idea that these are extraterrestrial entities. What if it's not? What if it's something else? This is, again, Robert Anton Wilson talking about abolishing the dogmatism that I think gets in the way of studying this stuff. If you come into it with a belief, then that's going to determine how you filter the data. Charles Fort, the fate of all explanations is to close one door only to have another one fly wide open. And does anybody remember this from the X-Files? This is the poster Mulder had up on his wall. I don't like this. Like, I don't want to believe. I think the way to turn this around, the best way to think of it is I want to know. Like, I want to understand what this stuff is. If I believe what it is, that's going to color my perception. It's going to color my way of looking at it. Just to finish up here, because I know I ran a little over. This is John Podesta, who was White House Chief of Staff for President Clinton. He was co-chair of the Obama transition team. He wrote the foreword to this book. I highly recommend if you're into the kind of nuts and bolts analysis of this stuff. UFOs, generals, pilots, and government officials go on the record. That's exactly what the book is. He said the American people around the world want to know, and they can handle the truth. This is a guy who was in charge of declassifying 800,000 pages of classified government documents. So maybe he saw something. But he's clearly a high government official who says, hey, we need to look at this scientifically. So thank you very much, and there's all my contact stuff. This is my book. There are flyers over there. I have to take the moment to pimp myself commercially. It's published by Random House, but it's only available as an ebook, so it's part of their Hydra imprint. But if you like the kind of stuff I talked about, this book is a fictionalization of a lot of it. So thank you very much. Thanks for coming out.